My guest this morning here at 105.5 WDHA on All Mixed Up is noted Beatles historian and author Bruce Spizer. Bruce, good morning and welcome.
Morning. Glad to be on the show.
So, we've been talking these past few weeks about the effects of the Beatles and that invasion, if you will, coming in February of 1964. The first episode, of course, of them appearing on the Ed Sullivan Show on February 9th. Tell us your memories of that night, Bruce.
I remember was at school, and at the time I was in the third grade, and everyone was talking about it that week. I mean, I have been listening to the Beatles on the radio since hearing I Want to Hold Your Hand on the Newman school bus in early January. And then all of a sudden, She Loves You is getting airplay and Please, Please Me. And, it was an exciting time because, most of us hadn't seen the Beatles yet. I hadn't seen them on the Jack Parr show or anything like that. So to me, it was, big excitement, and all the girls were talking about it more than the guys, but I wanted to see it. And my parents were curious. So we all watched in the living room on the TV. And I had two older sisters that were 7 and 8 years older than me. And none of us screamed at the TV. We all kind of just sat there transfixed. And when it was over, my parents were sort of like, well, I don't see what the big deal is.
My dad had a bit of a harsher reaction. It was, that's not music. I don't know what it is, but it's not music.
I didn't get anything quite that condemning.
My mom got it. My mom had seen, she'd grown up in Brooklyn and she had seen Frank Sinatra in the 40s.
Uh-huh. Oh, yeah.
Allegedly the first big pop star, if you will. So she kind of understood, even if she didn't get the Beatles themselves, she kind of understood what all the hype was about. And though my dad was a musician, he played a couple of different instruments, it was just over his head.
Yeah.
What was Beatlemania like? You grew up in New Orleans. What was Beatlemania like there? We had 3 a.m. radio stations that were trying to out-Beatle themselves here in the New York metropolitan area. But what was it like where you were?
We had two AM powerhouses in New Orleans, WTIX, who were the boss jocks, and the WNOE good guys. And kids would get in fights over on the playground over what station they listened to. I listened to WTIX, and I wouldn't have been caught dead listening to WNOE. That's just the way it was for many of us, and it would take a pretty horrible song to come on WTIX for me to consider switching to WNOE.
Yeah, here, as I said, they were trying to out-Beatle each other, with one
Yeah,
station claiming to have the fifth Beatle and another radio station, WABC, calling themselves WA Beatlesy. They just couldn't get enough Beatles here in this area.
the fun thing that we had in New Orleans, and that 60th anniversary is coming up, was when the Beatles played New Orleans on September 16th. And WNOE got the official sponsorship of the concert. And so, they had their banners up and all that other fun stuff. But WTIX sent their very popular boss jocks out to the place, and their disc jockeys were handing out leaflets telling them enjoy the concert, and on the way home be sure to tune in to WTIX to win Beatle prize packages. So I think WTIX hijacked the concert from WNOE.
So we've talked about February 9th being that first historic appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show, and there were two subsequent appearances as well in subsequent weeks. I remember watching, but I don't remember the same type of hysteria after those two appearances.
Well, let's put it this way. When you take the first show, 73 million people tuned in. So the second week, we knew there would be a drastic drop off, and there was. It dropped to about 72 million. But the third show in New York had, a more normal type viewership. But the interesting thing about the second show was it was going to be in Miami Beach all along, and at the Deauville Hotel, and Mitzi Gaynor was the headliner. And Mitzi Gaynor remained the headliner, although the Beatles opened and closed the show. But the audience in Miami Beach was more of a Mitzi Gaynor type crowd, shall we say, that basically a lot of the hotels in the area were owned by the same individual, and he at his hotels gave out all these tickets to see the Beatles, and there were people who were staying primarily at his hotels. So you had a much more adult audience. Nonetheless, I mean, they put on a good performance and people seemed to enjoy it, although I suspect the adults preferred Mitzi Gaynor.
Ed Sullivan had obviously flirted with rock and roll in the past. He'd had Elvis on, he'd had Buddy Holly on a couple of times. There were some other stars who kind of bordered on the early days of rock and roll, but
Domino.
right.
Yeah.
It wasn't really until the Beatles came, those 3 subsequent weeks. But even afterwards, I went through and I looked at a bunch of some of the artists who had played. The Dave Clark Five, who he loved. He had them on, I think, 5 times. They were in March. The next real rock and roll act, if you want to call them that, the Searchers in April. Stevie Wonder, along with Jerry and the Pacemakers in May. Other than that, it was more middle of the road and, artists who appealed to our parents.
It was a variety show. The idea behind a variety show was you wanted to attract multiple generations. You got to realize Ed Sullivan took place in the dark ages of television where families all gathered around the telly. The families had one TV if they had one at all. And on Sunday nights, your grandparents might be over for dinner. So you'd be in a situation where the kids, their parents, and the grandparents are sitting watching the same show. So Sullivan would have, people from Broadway shows or an opera singer or, a classical pianist or a classical guitarist. And then something for the youngsters, which how the Beatles would get into that formula. He would have comedians. And he also would have these novelty acts. So one I remember most was the guy running around spinning plates to the tune of Saber Dance. I'll never forget that one. I reacted sometimes when I give talks just for fun, running around spinning imaginary plates. It's a lot of fun.
And who could forget Topo Gigio?
Ah, Topo Gigio. Yeah, Eddie kissing me goodnight. I'll tell you a funny story about Topo Gigio. The Beatles, for their programs, the live ones on Sullivan, got $3,500. And for the tape one, they got $3,000. It was the best bargain both men, Brian Epstein and Ed Sullivan, ever cut for many reasons. But to give you an idea, Topo Gigio, when he appeared on the show, got $3,500. So
wow.
No wonder why. I mean, for $3,500 back then, that's $35,000. I guess I'd let Ed Sullivan kiss me for that,
There's a line in a Paul Simon song about every generation sends a hero up the pop charts. And I think back to some of the other artists over the years who had that big wave of popularity and fame, even if it only lasted for a little while. The Monkees, obviously, the Backstreet Boys, although they've managed to continue their career a lot longer than some of the other acts. NSYNC, Justin Bieber, Bruce, for about 3 years, we had a life-size cardboard cutout of Justin Bieber in one of my daughter's rooms. I felt as if he was a member of the family. BTS, the Korean band. And now we have Taylor Swift, a phenomenon unlike anything I've really seen since the Beatles. What's your take on what's going on with her and the impact that she's having?
I mean, I think, she seems to have more multi-generational appeal right now, which I think really helps because, you've got mothers taking their daughters to the concerts, but the mothers want to go to the concerts. Where I think with the Beatles, the parents dropping their kids off at the concerts was more the norm. And when they did go, they really didn't like it or couldn't stand all the shouting. So I don't think Taylor Swift will have the same impact down the road. I think she's done a phenomenal job now, obviously, but I don't think, 60 years from now, people will be talking about, I remember the first time Taylor Swift did such and such, and her career didn't explode the way Beatlemania did in America. It took a little bit of a while for the Swifties and all the other things to really get rolling. So there are some parallels, but there are a lot of things that are really different. I mean, it took a perfect storm for Beatlemania to explode in America the way it did. Bear in mind that their first record releases in America essentially flopped. Love Me Do was not initially released at all. And then Please Please Me and From Me to You came out on VJ. And when VJ had financial troubles, that agreement was canceled and they ended up on Swan Records, which was an even smaller company than VJ. And so the records weren't doing anything, although there was one disc jockey who really championed them in Worcester, Massachusetts, Dick the Derby Smith. And in December of 63, and bear in mind, this is before Beatlemania really hit, the mid-survey, and their surveys were based strictly on listener requests. And She Loves You at that time was number 10 on the charts. And you might say, wow, that's really impressive. Guess what was number 1 that same week? I'll Get You, the B-side to She Loves You, based on listener requests, which emphasizes the quality of the Beatles' music. So when the Beatles do explode and Capitol's putting all this money behind them and everything's falling into place, they put out I Want to Hold Your Hand, and then Swan re-releases She Loves You in an attractive picture sleeve. VJ puts Please Please Me and From You together on a record with an attractive picture sleeve. So you've got all that going. And you might say, well, but what really pushed it along? What made Capitol, who had turned down the group 4 times, sign them? Brian Epstein talked to the president of Capitol, Alan Livingston, and said, why won't you put out our records? And Alan listened to them. And when he called Brian back, Brian ran a bluff. He said, well, we won't let you release it unless you spend $40,000 promoting it. And, of course, Brian couldn't stop Capitol from releasing the records. And so Capitol had to come up with a creative marketing campaign to exploit the Beatles. And in those days, the way you promoted a band or a record was you took out an ad in Billboard and Cashbox, if you were really daring, maybe Music Vendor, and you felt you'd done your job because you would inform distributors about it and disc jockeys about it and record stores about it. And if the record got played and record stores had it, you'd done your job. Capitol marketed directly to the consumer, and that had never been done on a large scale. The other things that really made it click, and it's little things, you couldn't make all this up if you tried. And that was that I Want to Hold Your Hand originally was going to be released in mid-January 1964. If that happens, by the time they're on the Sullivan Show, maybe it's top 20, maybe 30 million people turn in, maybe 40 million. But the Beatlemania would not have hit the way it did, but for a series of little things. Thing number one, in September 1 of 1963, CBS News expands from a 15-minute broadcast to a 30-minute broadcast with their evening news with Walter Cronkite. Why is that important? They can run feature stories. So now their London bureau does a feature story on the Beatles, and that airs on the CBS Morning News with Mike Wallace and is going to air that evening on the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite to a much larger audience. But the day is Friday, November 22nd, and President Kennedy is assassinated. Obviously, the story doesn't run. On December 10th, Walter Cronkite thinks, well, the mood of a nation is such that we could use a fun little story on this phenomena happening in England that could never happen here, this musical group, the Beatles. We've got the Kennedy assassination, the Cold War, civil rights unrest, and so he runs it. And Sullivan, who had booked the Beatles a month earlier, sees it, and he gets all excited, and he calls up Cronkite, and he says, Walter, what can you tell me about those bugs or whatever they call themselves? And the next day, CBS begins promoting the fact that they're going to have the Beatles on the Sullivan Show. And the other big thing is a 15-year-old girl in Silver Spring, Maryland, Marcia Albert, sees the broadcast, and she sends an email. No, they didn't have email then. She writes a letter to her local DJ, as Chuck Berry would say. And the next thing, and she says, look, I saw this group, the Beatles, on the CBS Evening News. Why can't we have music like that in America? And Carol James, who was the DJ there, has a friend who's a stewardess, as they were called then, for British Overseas Airways Corporation. And he asks her, bring me the latest Beatles record. So she brings him I Want to Hold Your Hand. On December 17th, he has Marcia Albert announce the record. Very cute. They recorded it. And the record gets played. And Carol James says, write us and let you know what you think. And kids didn't write. They called up the station immediately and wanted to hear the thing again. And it's becoming a hit in Washington, D.C., in other markets where they had dubbed the single as well. And so Capitol has their attorney, Walter Hofer, call up WWDC and demand they quit playing the record because it's not coming out till mid-January. And Carol James says, are you nuts? It's a hit. Put the record out. And so Capitol basically tells their employees, guess what you're going to be doing from now to Christmas? Pressing records. And so they launched the Beatles campaign, and the record comes out the day after Christmas. And as you know, WMCA jumps on it, WABC, WINS jump on it. Kids are out of school. They're playing video games. No, wait, they didn't have video games back then. They're listening to the radio, and they hear the song. They love it. They have Christmas and Hanukkah money. Mommy and daddy can take them to the record stores. If within a week or so, it's number one on WABC, and the rest of the nation soon follows. So Beatlemania has hit America. She Loves You gets airplay, Please Please Me, even album tracks. And that's why 73 million people tuned in to see them on the Sullivan Show. That was not the birth of Beatlemania. Beatlemania was full swing before the Sullivan Show. That's why 73 million people tuned in to begin with. But what I like to say is the Ed Sullivan Show put the explanation point on Beatlemania.
It most certainly did. I know you have a new book that you're working on, and you're looking for fan contributions to that. Tell our listeners about that, Bruce.
Yes, the book is called The Beatles, A Hard Day's Night and More. And the and more is going to talk about all the crazy things that were going on, mainly in the U.S. by this time during 1964, in addition to this wonderful album and film, A Hard Day's Night, where you have VJ releasing for the first time Beatles singles with songs that were on there introducing the Beatles album, like Twist and Shout, Do You Want to Know a Secret? Love Me Do gets released actually for the first time in the U.S., and it becomes a #1 song. The Beatles versus the Four Seasons. Songs,
I remember that.
Stories of the Fabulous Beatles. Jolly What, the Beatles and Frank Ifield on stage, which is a very misleading title because there are no live songs on it. That was the fallback album, as my book explains, done for legal reasons, not because they really felt that Beatle fans wanted to hear Frank Ifield.
Well, you can check that out. And if you have contributions, make them on Beatle.net. Bruce Spizer, thank you so much for sharing your time and memories with us this morning here on WDHA.
I'd love to do it. And when we get to that lovely season of the 60th anniversary of A Hard Day's Night, I'd be glad to come on back and tell some fun stories about that as well.